Welcome back to Birds of a Feather Talk Together. This week we were talking about the double-crested cormorant. I'm sure you've seen them sitting up above the water with their wings stretched out, drying off after feeding underwater. They're a super cool bird that is actually quite colorful when you see them up close. We talk about these birds, the effects of the recent hurricane, and also answer a question on swans this week. Also, on a personal level, a fun announcement that Amanda and I just got engaged last week. We were down in Florida before the hurricane hit, so there's a little bit of engagement talk at the beginning of the episode before we get into talking about birds. Okay, go grab your binoculars and let's get into it.
I knew RJ had a ring. I really hoped it was going to happen in Florida, but I was kind of nervous that it wouldn't. I was super intent on it happening in Florida. We got to Anna Maria Island on a Saturday, and then for Sunday was our first full day, and we had an amazing beach day and showered and got ready to go to a happy hour. We have a happy hour place on the island that they do a special for raw oysters and then margaritas. So it's the best thing ever. So we went to our favorite happy hour place and did our raw oysters and our margaritas, and I had it on my mind. Hopefully we're gonna get engaged on this trip and stuff. But again, I didn't know if it was gonna happen or not. And I asked him while we were eating, are you nervous about getting engaged? And because I thought
that's an unsubtle hint, Amanda.
I know. Well,
I had the
it's
ring
funny.
in my pocket at that time. I was like, does she know?
You better be prepared
No, and I just
or
thought,
else.
yeah, exactly. And I just thought he was I thought I sensed a little tension or nervousness or something, and I was just trying to root out what he was feeling and stuff. And but we had a great happy hour, great dinner, and then he suggested we walk home on the beach, and it was one of those days. It was in the 90s, and the only way to be cool was either to be inside in air conditioning or go swimming. So on the walk home, we said, let's go back, get in our swimsuits and go swimming again. And as we were walking, this is what we were talking about. And then he said, well, actually, before we do that, and then I knew something was happening, and he took, I was carrying all our food that we had, our leftovers from the restaurant. He took those from me and put them on the ground, and then he got down on one knee. This was just at the water's edge, and proposed, and it was amazing. It was amazing. It was a total shock. I had no idea it was going to come in that moment and stuff, and I was elated. I was so happy. So it was
excellent.
It was amazing.
So nervous.
Yeah. What's that, RJ?
I was so nervous.
Oh, well, good.
Were you waiting for her to say no? What made you
No,
nervous?
I was just nervous, just having the ring in my pocket. I just was we were walking, we were sitting on at happy hour on high chairs or whatever, and
Yes.
I'm holding my pocket shut that it won't fall out, and it's the walk over there, just triple checking my, that everything is still there.
Yes.
No, I was just I don't know.
I think that's a primary reason why ring boxes are the size they are.
Yeah,
So you can easily make sure that they're still there.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, it's funny,
Yes.
the ring box that I got, I told the jeweler that I was going to do this. Originally, we were going to do it, I was going to ask her on this kayaking trip, but we decided that I was that's too risky. But so I got a ring box that was a little more discreet, a smaller one. So it was actually hidden more. But so that made it even scarier, because I'm is it still there? And then
Yes.
I don't know. And then I'd go to into the bathroom and open it up and make sure the ring was still in the ring box and it hadn't somehow come out.
For sure. Yeah.
Yes. So,
Well, you
but
did
yeah,
it.
It was so exciting.
Yeah.
Yes.
It was
Yeah.
sweet.
Yes.
Yes.
So what's that area like right now?
Yeah, so it got very flooded. So it wasn't in the path of the hurricane, but it's still all the, surges and everything. So we looked on, there's like a Anna Maria Island Facebook group we've been looking at, and it just has like people posting pictures, and like all the buildings are like, anyone that's on the first floor, like got, 3-4 feet of water. It's like all the sand got pushed up. There's sand all the way up to the windows. All the roads are covered in sand. So, it's really, I think it comparatively to like, towns that are actually in the path, it's not as bad, but I still think there's a lot to be done there.
My understanding was it actually went straight through one of the least populated places of all of Florida.
Oh,
in the grand scheme of things, and not that there weren't people really hit hard. It's just that it could have been a heck of a lot worse people wise than it was.
Oh, I didn't realize that.
Yeah, I guess that bend in Florida is a really underpopulated place in terms of beach development and everything like that.
Okay. We couldn't believe, because where we were was south of Tampa. So, we were pretty far from where it actually hit, and to see that kind of impact that it had when, we were that far away was still pretty crazy.
Yeah, well, when you warm the oceans, guess what happens?
Right.
Yeah.
Predicted. Actually.
Yeah.
Right.
I don't know all the metrics and everything, but I feel like I've been hearing this is one of the largest ones that's happened in a long time.
I was actually asking Shannon whether the winds we've had could be at least tangentially related to it, meaning that, now that it's come up, that it's just affecting national weather in the East.
Yeah.
But there were 70-mile-an-hour winds in Miami apparently that night.
Oh, wow.
As it went north.
Wow.
That's huge.
Yeah. Yeah. We were wondering how, a hurricane like that impacts like bird migration. Are there studies on that, or is it kind of?
So, it's hard to study, right? So actually somebody posted a picture, I think on the North Shore Bird Chat, that clearly showed radar imagery suggesting in the eye there were radar scatter that was almost certainly birds.
Oh.
And so birds like frigate birds showed up in Tennessee and things. And so seabirds get moved in. But the migration thing is a really interesting one to me, because every time I see images of what happens during large hurricanes, you wonder what small birds are doing. And my guess is they're just finding whatever place they can to hunker down. And you've got to think there's some mortality in those situations, but I don't think anybody has any idea.
I think there's a lot of mortality. We have an anecdote, at least, at the museum with bad weather. We had that horrible storm.
For sure.
Was it?
Have we told you this?
No.
So this is a paper we published. So what happened was our assistant collection manager was walking his dogs on the beach at Montrose, and he started noticing birds washing up on the shore, little migrant birds. And so he came into the museum and he mentioned it, and we started combing the beaches. And from Oak Street up to Illinois Beach over the next probably almost 2 weeks, we picked up over 2,000 birds of 124 species. And this was right when radar was becoming available. And we found this graduate student who was working on radar scatter in birds. And he went back through the radar archives and was able to show basically a single night in, I can't remember the date, but in April or so, where you can see about 8:30 in the evening, there's just a massive number of birds up over the lake. And this thunderstorm line just comes straight south along the lake. And it probably killed upwards of tens of thousands of birds.
Oh my gosh.
Because we were just finding the ones that made it to shore. The gulls were lined up on the shore eating them. The fish were eating them. I'm just, it's just, so it definitely happens.
Wow.
And
it's crazy.
And yet it's still worth migrating for these birds, because that's not a human mediated event at all, I don't think.
Except they're worsened by the things humans have done to the environment.
For sure. No, for sure.
Do birds all it's migration? How much of migration happens at night?
I would say it's interesting trying to decide on what, how do you calculate that numerically? But species-wise, the vast majority of birds migrate at night. There are some groups like orioles and blackbirds that seem to migrate mostly during the day. Hummingbirds migrate during the day for the most part. There's some other individual groups that do that, but no, a lot of it is at night.
This is what Jacob Drucker studies, actually, and so we should have Jacob back on to talk about the technology behind this, and what he knows about birds, how they move differently, north to south, south to north, how the U.S. differs from what he sees in the New World tropics and Colombia and places like that. So it's really interesting. So he's not just an expert in Hawaii, but we should have him on again to talk about bird migration.
So why do we think they primarily migrate at night?
Good question. I think a lot of it may be safety issues, but some of it can be, I think, aspects of weather patterns and wind at night, and
Okay.
yeah, that's a good question.
Or even that you spent the day feeding enough to
feeding.
get ready
Good
to
point.
migrate. So you're not doing it after you've slept and, had your metabolism get rid of some of the food that you've taken up. So I think would be interesting to watch if you could watch individual birds and see what their day was like before they migrate. I mean, how differently do they behave during the day before they get up and leave? But you'd have to have marked birds to know that.
But coming back to hurricanes just for a second, because again, there's one where you could go 10 to 15 years without having one that's problematic for migration. So I don't know that they can do anything more than hunker down when it happens. And yet it could happen. And the story I always tell is there's this guy named Ariel Lugo who was a botanist that worked in Puerto Rico. And one of his primary comments was that Puerto Rico has no climax forest. And a bunch of ecologists were really upset with him for saying that. But the reason he was saying it was he said, look, hurricanes come through and they just take down these forests every, in this unpredictable period of time, but on a regular basis. And I'll never forget, he came and gave a seminar back when they showed slides, and he shows this picture of the Caribbean, and he says, here's the Caribbean, and now I'm going to show you where the eye of every recorded hurricane has gone over. And the next slide was completely black.
Oh.
And I think, he was taking some license there, but the point was that hurricanes just track over this landscape in a random fashion. And every year there are some of them, and they go where they're going to go. And on a place like Puerto Rico, it's going to get hit by hurricanes. So what all that means is that over evolutionary time, those birds have had to face those situations. And so they must have some mechanisms to basically hunker down.
Okay.
And as Shannon saying, even thunderstorms can be problematic if you run into them. So,
John, what's a climax forest?
So climax just means like a really tall, old, mature forest. So like trees that are, and when they talk about it in what's the best way to illustrate it? The funny thing is in North America, there aren't very many climax forests. Yes. So the sequoias and would be a supreme example of super long-lived trees that are up there. But then the question is, what's going on underneath that forest with younger trees? And so like the entire state of Pennsylvania, for instance, was logged by Europeans. And before that forest probably had trees in it that were hundreds of years old that were cut down. And now everything is only about 150 years old at most.
Okay.
And even those are fairly far between. And so Amazonia is a good example of that. So you go into Amazonia and the question is, have those trees been there for hundreds of years versus 40 years or so? And how much turnover is there?
Okay, cool.
I mean, birds who live in those environments, they obviously have adaptations to do that, whether that's the ability to survive having extreme population reductions, which probably happens in all of these places, that, birds may have some way of surviving, whether they have behavioral mechanisms to know where to hunker down, to go in their version of the basement or an inside room. But they almost certainly have tremendous population declines from those things.
And of course, we know that one of the things that happens is birds get pushed around by these systems too. So the birders are always hoping for vagrants as a result of hurricanes, and that absolutely happens. Yeah, so we have a sooty tern specimen from Wisconsin over the last couple of years, and it's definitely correlated with some weather systems that moved across from the southeast, I think, and would have pushed the bird up here.
Well, should we talk about double-crested cormorants? Are we ready to get into that?
Well, congratulations on getting engaged.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Oh, thank
you.
you.
It's a very sweet story.
Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, we were excited to talk about double-crested cormorants too, because we saw so many of them last time we were down in Florida, and then we've seen a ton of them in Illinois this summer now. And so, I don't know, the more we see them, the more we really have fallen in love with them. They're so cool.
Yeah,
I mean, I think it's a great choice because it's a bird that people notice.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of times, if they're not completely into birds, they may not know what they are. And so they're one that once they see that, they can identify it pretty readily.
Yeah, we'd always seen them kind of from a distance and really thought they're cool. And obviously when they're, drying their wings and everything, it's really fun to see. But really when we saw them up close and like with binoculars was when we realized really how striking, kind of all like how colorful their face is, their bright blue eyes, their blue inside of their mouth. Like they're just a really colorful bird, but you don't really notice it until you see them up close.
I wonder what people, before they know what they are, if they see them in the water, what they think they are. Do you think people think they might be loons?
The Loch Ness Monster.
Maybe. It's a pretty weak Loch Ness Monster. It's too small.
So we saw last summer a double-crested cormorant when we were at a lake in Indiana, and we were down by the water. It was like early in the morning and kind of spooked one and didn't realize it was right on the edge of the water, and it jumped in the water and swam off, and all we could see was its head.
Yeah.
The rest of its body was under the water, and it was before we even knew really what they were. So we were worried. We're like, is that bird injured? Like we were kind of... So when we saw it and didn't know what they were, we thought there was something wrong with it.
I mean, that's the trademark of them once you know, is that basically they look like a snake coming out of the water. You just don't see the rest of the body under the water. And that's why I was wondering what people thought they might be. So it's interesting that you thought it was injured.
Yeah.
We thought it was like an injured duck or something.
There's another bird that we will talk about probably at some point called anhinga, which is another family, and they're literally regularly swim with only their neck out. Whereas the cormorants seem to be a little more buoyant and can actually have, at least half of their body out a lot of times.
So I saw a lot of anhingas when I was growing up down in Florida and would visit my grandparents. And so when Amanda and I went to Florida 6 months ago, I kept saying like, oh, we're going to see anhingas. We're going to see anhingas. And then we saw double-crested cormorants everywhere. And in my head, I was wondering, like, was I always seeing double-crested cormorants? Were they actually anhingas that I was seeing when I was younger? Like, are there... Because we didn't see very many anhingas recently.
Right. And they're both there. And so, it's a matter of getting used to looking at the bill, for instance, because cormorants always have this hooked tip of the bill. Whereas anhingas have a dagger-like bill that they actually sometimes spear fish with, as opposed to just grabbing them. And so the cormorants are actually using this hook-shaped bill to grab fish with their bills, and that's how they're foraging. So they're, and I would say anhingas are smaller and a little more delicate, but it can definitely be something when you get a quick look. The question is, what is it?
But they are each other's closest relatives, too, so cormorants and anhingas. Okay. So it's not surprising that you look at them and they seem kind of similar to you. So you're reflecting the tree of life.
Well, and there are different behavioral positions where you can see them too. So the other thing is both those birds, double-crested cormorant and the North American anhinga, will soar sometimes. And so they can be really high up in the thermals, and you got to look at them by shape and figure out what they are. And so I've been excited lots of times when I see a bird high up that looks like it's got this big, long kind of fan tail and a long neck that's sticking straight out, and it's very dark. And I'll put my binoculars on it, hoping, that it might be an anhinga, and it's invariably a double-crested cormorant.
Okay.
So when we were preparing for today, we were reading about I guess I never thought what the term double-crested meant.
Because you don't see those things very often or almost ever.
That's what I was going to say. I don't think we've ever seen those.
I think that's true for most people.
Okay.
They're hard to even see in specimens, actually. You can. This is not easy when you can look at the bird like 4 inches from your face. It's not so easy to see those little tufts coming out. Crest is an over word for what they really are, I think.
That makes sense to me. Yeah.
It's along the lines of red-bellied woodpecker.
Oh,
where it's there, but go ahead and try to see.
Well, and other things have red
That's
bellies. So
really
why
good
did
point.
that bird get the red belly label and not
Right.
the other ones that have bright red bellies? I don't know.
Because it's got a red belly, just like double-crested cormorant has a double crest. Sometimes.
Wait, so have either of you seen in the wild those double crests?
Quiet, silent. Yeah, sort of. I mean, it's a breeding season thing too. More, I think.
Yeah, well, I've
So-
seen double-crested cormorants during the breeding season, but so that meant I probably should have seen the little double crests, but I don't have any visual memory of that. I mean, when you look at pictures online, some of them, they can be colored too, right? You can have white ones, but I don't ever remember seeing, and I do remember thinking, why on earth are they called that?
Oh,
That-
that makes
that
me feel
common
so much
name.
better. Yeah.
It's not the most obvious physical attribute that these birds have, these double crests that you don't
Right.
see.
I would call them like pretty turquoise eyes. That's what I would call.
Yeah, the eyes are definitely more part of what you would see than those crests.
Yeah.
So the family that they're in, the Phalacrocoracidae is what it's called, has 40 species in it, and they occur all over the world. And there is one that's called blue-eyed shag, and shag is the European word for cormorant, the British word, and it's definitely so. There are multiple blue-eyed members of the family. It's not an
wow.
uncommon iris color.
That's crazy. I like the name Blue-Eyed Shag. That's a good name.
I mean, you guys sent me down a rabbit hole because something happened in the last few years that I didn't know about, which is that the genus of double-crested cormorant changed. It used to be under Phalacrocorax, and then a DNA-based study was done, a Tree of Life study was done to show that there's a lot of genomic diversity and the lineages are distantly related, but all the things that were called Phalacrocorax were not all each other's closest relatives. So the double-crested cormorant was separated from the rest of them. So the double-crested cormorant, the neotropic cormorant, and
Flightless cormorant from the Galapagos.
Yeah, I wanted to call it Galapagos cormorant, but that's not its real name. They are all each other's closest relatives, and they're now in a genus called Nanopterum. So, of course, because I love words. So Phalacrocorax is a Latinized ancient Greek thing, and phalacrox meant bald, and corax meant raven, so bald ravens, which kind of makes sense. But now, and the auritus part means ear, so that the species name was auritus. So that means, so even their species name mentions something that you will almost never see. not just the common name. But now the Nanopterum, nanos means dwarf, and pteron means wing, so dwarf wing. So it's named after the one that's found in the Galapagos, which has a smaller wing.
Is that the flightless one?
Yeah, and so where that's happening is, so what's going on there is that's some nomenclatural rules where they decided that the available generic name for those three birds, which are all New World cormorants, so neotropic, double-crested, and the Galapagos cormorant, the flightless cormorant, are three primarily freshwater cormorants in the New World. And they're actually they're a pretty old part of the lineage of within the whole phylogeny, meaning that they've been around for a long time from an evolutionary sense.
Yeah, and there are lots of fossils, so we know that they're 6.5 to 8 million years old. That's pretty old, which is also another interesting aspect of them. And one of the reasons why the people who did this genetic study created a whole bunch of new genera is because for them it was a recognition of the age of some of the lineages. So they erected and created a bunch of new genera that didn't exist. Almost all of them were under Phalacrocorax historically until a couple of years ago. The study came out in 2014 by some New Zealand people, but the bird authorities, I use that in quotes, the bird authorities decided in 2021, 2022 that they would have these new genus names, which I knew that study had come out, but I wasn't really paying attention to the taxonomy part. So when I went to look them up, I said, where does this word come from? And it's because they, were put under an old genus that now applies to those three species. And we have 478 of them in our collections.
Oh, wow.
But if you go look, they're under Phalacrocorax. They're not under Nanopterum. So we have that many double-crested cormorants in our collection.
And they will be under Nanopterum in the future.
Well, don't hold your breath.
And then are double-crested are those the only ones in the U.S.
No.
No. Okay.
So neotropic is an interesting one because it's got a very broad distribution in South America and comes all the way up into Mexico, and then more recently is becoming more common actually all the way up into Chicago.
No
Really?
way.
There's a sighting or two almost every year.
Really?
It's not clear whether those are just wandering birds, but they breed in the southern part of the U.S. now.
Oh. And how different do they look from the double-crested?
Now, that's an interesting thing. They're smaller.
Okay.
But the ID patterns have to do with the face coloration, and so they can be a little bit hard to tell apart. Except that cormorants like to sit up sometimes. You've probably seen them on telephone lines and stuff. And so if a line of double-crested cormorants was there and there was a neotropic among them, you would see it as being noticeably smaller.
Okay. But if it's by itself, you probably wouldn't really.
It becomes a hard ID problem. Yeah.
Okay.
And there are also pelagic cormorants too. So ones I was kind of more used to before moving to the U.S.
Well, and I would say double-crested is interesting because you can see it along the ocean, the sea coasts too. You can see it in saltwater and in freshwater. So while I would call it mostly a freshwater bird, it still occurs along the Atlantic and Pacific coast pretty readily.
I mean, the reality, though, is if you see a cormorant on an inland lake, it's almost certainly going to be a double-crested cormorant. So if you go to the Pacific Northwest and you're on the West Coast, you'll see pelagic cormorants. And those are ones that are in the salt water. But none of them, the double-crested cormorants don't forage in deep waters. So you're not going to see them, like an albatross or something like that way out.
With the interesting caveat that at some point in evolutionary time, something, either a neotropic cormorant or a double-crested cormorant got all the way out to the Galapagos and eventually became flightless cormorant.
Oh, wow.
And those things, if you look at pictures of the wing, they have like little mini wings.
Okay.
It's really interesting.
Does it affect the way that they swim at all? Because don't they use their wings while they're swimming as well,
No.
right?
So
These ones
no?
don't.
I think
They use their feet, mostly to
Okay.
propel themselves. So they have lobed, or webbed feet, I guess.
toes.
Yeah,
Lobed
thank
toes.
you. But they don't. So they don't propel themselves with their wings. So I don't. I mean,
Oh,
I don't
okay.
know what the foot of a flightless cormorant looks like. Do you know, John?
Well, I think a lot of it's just that I think what Shannon was saying, that regular cormorants don't rely a whole lot on their wings as much as they do their feet and their kind of body. And so I think Galapagos cormorants over evolutionary time have just probably accentuated some of that because they got to the Galapagos and were able to basically get away with not having to fly. I mean, which is interesting because, so coming back to double-crested, I mean, double-crested is an interesting bird in the sense that it's migratory. And so you can see flocks of up to 1,000 or so along Lake Michigan in the spring and sometimes in the fall too, with these big numbers moving back and forth to wintering grounds versus breeding grounds.
It's amazing. Jeez.
The one interesting note that I read, I was just kind of curious if this is like a unique thing for cormorants, but there was a note that said that they're heavy-boned birds. And I know obviously most birds their bones are so light and that allows them to fly. Are cormorants like, is the heavy bone something that allows them to swim better, or do you know anything about that?
So I think that's an interesting trade-off in that bird. I mean, I wonder whether anybody's actually looked at it in detail. So my guess is that the heaviness helps them be able to sink faster, and they're pursuing fish, and so you've got to have some ability to get down and get under. At the same time, they still have the capacity to fly, and so that's a trade-off, that you can't be too heavy-boned and still get out of the water.
Well, Cory bustards
Yeah.
still fly.
For sure.
So, I mean, heavy is kind of in the eye of the beholder. So if you look at the bones of birds that run around on the ground and don't fly, their bones are actually heavy.
Oh, okay.
But if you look at pelicans, pelican bones are so light and delicate, you wouldn't. And that bird doesn't always look so graceful when it goes and dives into the water, right? You'd be surprised at how really light and delicate its bones are compared to a land bird.
But there's another interesting question with respect to cormorants in Anopterum per se. You predict that, for instance, flightless cormorants in the Galapagos would probably have heavier bones on average than the neotropic and double-crested cormorants that are flying.
Do they walk? I don't ever think of cormorants walking, but I imagine the flightless one walks a lot. So what does it look like?
I think they basically hop. That would be another interesting thing, because have you guys seen any of the cormorant nesting colonies in Illinois?
Oh, geez.
No.
They're disgusting.
There's a real nice. They're interesting. There's a real nice colony up at a place called Trumpet Marsh up on the Wisconsin border that we should go by sometime.
Okay.
As Shannon's saying, I mean, when they build their nests in trees, a lot of times they like to find trees on islands, and they spend all their time
Pooping?
essentially get it. Well, yeah. So they're not walking around; they're going to and from the nest. I mean, these are not birds that can travel well on the ground, for sure.
They'll poop so much that it'll kill the trees,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, and you see that when you see these big colonies. It is bleak, let's just say, around the colony.
Yeah.
And then
And in the Midwest, their numbers have increased dramatically. And one of the things that's happened is when they take over islands like that in somebody's beautiful Northwoods lake, a lot of times people get tired of that. And then they also feel like they're competing for the fish. And so there have been a number of campaigns to reduce the size of colonies in various places, based on the fact that the populations are going up and people are thinking that they're actually hurting the fish populations
so
in the
the
area.
fisheries people, there's no love, there's a hate relationship that fisheries people have with cormorants, so strong that laws were created to allow culling of them, to allow them to be collected on certain lands, because they, if they do increase in numbers that way, I mean, your fish ponds that you're cultivating are kind of prime feeding real estate of confined fish for a cormorant, and they can eat a lot of fish over a short period of time. They're fairly big, right? So your fisheries probably are in trouble. And that's certainly caused a lot of conflict between fisheries, people who are farm fishing, and people who don't like poopy areas in their around their houses and things like that. So you can, under certain circumstances, you can get permits to kill them, to cull them, and lower the number.
Now, have you guys seen some of the nesting colonies in Florida when you've been down there?
No, I don't think we
saw
have.
any nesting colonies. No.
Yeah, I wish we had. We in preparing for this, we were reading about that they produce like pellets, like an owl, kind of.
With little bones. Yeah, the fish bones and things. Yeah. It's just, some of that stuff is indigestible. And of course, fish bones can be really sharp. And so, you don't want to keep passing that down your digestive system if there's a possibility that it's going to poke a hole in your intestines. And so they have the capacity to basically grind those things up, get most of the nutrition out, and then cough up the fish ball.
Oh, wow. Okay. That's
You
awesome.
want to hear a fun fact? Their babies
Yes.
poop out of the nest, like explode poop away from the nest. So everything makes those nest areas absolutely disgusting.
Wow.
Like they lean over the edge,
so it
doesn't
they
get
stick
in
their
the nest.
butt over the edge of the nest and just spray
Like in the
poop out.
That's
There you go.
Let's
good
be polite
your,
at least.
manners. Yeah.
I mean, that is kind of true, right? You don't want to soil the place that you live in, especially if there are parasites, things like that. So, their version of diapers, maybe. But still,
Well, it
it's
sounds like their
gross.
nests are pretty nasty to begin with too, though, right? Don't they bring in a lot of, like I saw they might use like pieces of dead birds to build their nests or something?
Yeah, I saw that too.
Well,
you heard that?
I didn't see that, but I will tell you that from my experience in South Georgia Island, penguins will do that. So I think a lot of it's just like what's laying around, and after there's nothing left but the skeleton.
Yeah.
At some level, it's not much different than a piece of wood.
Okay.
That is bleak, John.
Yeah, no kidding. The skin color does more than just give you pretty eyes and pretty facial skin, because they have this throat, this gular, that bird people call them gulars, pouches, and they flutter that to control heat. Birds can't sweat, so they have to dissipate heat. And there's lots of different ways birds across the tree of life for birds have evolved to either retain heat or dissipate heat. And one of them is through fluttering that the skin in that gular pouch to get the heat away from their bodies. And people have done studies to show that as the birds get hotter, as the environment gets hotter, they flap that thing more and more frequently. So there's a relationship between the degree of fluttering and the actual temperature that the bird is experiencing.
Oh, very cool. And Shannon, are they related to the frigate bird?
Not really, but they do
Okay.
they do kind of, they're large and dark the way frigate birds are. They, they have skin on their throat but they don't kind of expand it the way a frigate bird does, like blowing up a balloon. They don't do that.
But their bill's very similar, and so yeah, I mean they're definitely they morphologically they're similar looking, with the caveat that frigate birds are doing almost everything on the wing.
So,
whereas cormorants
but
are
they
doing
are
everything
in
on the
that
water.
part of the tree. They're
Okay.
just anhingas are closer. So you start stepping back,
Okay.
you get to frigate birds fast.
I gotcha.
Okay.
Very cool.
When we did like a little boat tour on our trip, and there was like, you know, wildlife guide that was just giving little info, and he told us about, this was kind of horrible, we thought, but the cormorant fishing. Have you heard of this? How people use cormorants to
They tie
Yeah,
them
fish?
next.
I guess
China.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So they tie a
So-
rope around their neck and then let the cormorant go down and get a fish. And then I guess they tie the rope tight enough that if it's a small enough fish, the cormorant can swallow it. But if it's too big of one, it won't be able to swallow it. And they take the fish out and keep it. And I thought that was like pretty cruel.
Yeah.
But
That's
Humans and wildlife are amazing.
yeah. So
Wow.
I don't know exactly how this happens, which I think would be pretty interesting to know. And with genomes, we can probably get some insight into this. But they do have adaptations for swimming underwater. Because if you're going after fish like that under the water, so they're not just seeing the fish in the air and kind of plunging on it the way some birds do. They're not using their feet the way an osprey might. They're actually going under the water and chasing after schools of fish. And so they have thickened and flat corneas, things that improve vision under the water. They have different muscular arrangements to control the way their eyes move. They also hinge their jaws so that they have a special way that their jaws connect to their skull that lets them open it up wider so they can get a bigger fish. So they do have really cool adaptations for being underwater.
That's awesome.
I hate to ask to like rank a bird, but as far as like swimming abilities, I mean, are penguins one of the top underwater swimmers and cormorants close behind? Or, I mean, where do they fall as far as like agility underwater? And, you know,
I actually put them in a fairly mundane category because I don't think they go all that deep. And
Okay.
so I would put penguins at the absolute top. I mean, they're doing amazing things. The next group of birds I would bring in would be probably loons.
okay.
And then if we're talking about like what we call surface divers, loons will go down 100 feet into the water column to catch fish. You know, so they're clearly really adapted to do that. I think the maximum depth that as Shannon was saying earlier, that they tend not to be found on big lakes and they're feeding in the shallows. And so they're really good at catching stuff in shallow water, but they're not going to dive down 30 feet even, probably, very often.
So where do you put grebes in that perspective?
Yeah, that's an interesting question because cormorants are big, and there are no grebes that are, at least no extant grebes that are anywhere near the size of cormorants. So they're really good at diving. They probably dive much farther than the average cormorant will, and can stay under longer. So maybe they're better, but they're smaller.
And they
we'll have to put them in their own bracket next year when we do
the diving bracket,
the surface divers.
Exactly. That's awesome.
As long as you're very careful of who you put in, RJ, your winner last year did not. That is I still protest the results of that election.
She's still upset about
totally
that.
am.
The voters have spoken. It wasn't
you bribed
wasn't just
people.
me.
I know you did. You were in the grocery store giving people money and asking to use their phones.
free stickers.
Yes. Oh,
well, I did have one more note that this was just a small like excerpt that I saw, but this just made me smile about double-crested cormorants. There was a thing that said their main two activities are fishing and resting. And I just thought, like, what a life.
yeah.
So I wanted.
I would feel like that's probably the case for a lot of birds, but for some reason when I saw that, I was like, that makes me smile.
Yeah.
No, and they often do it in a regular way. So I'll give you an example that struck me is we drive down to the museum on Lakeshore Drive, and I'd say for the last 7 to 10 years or so, every single late summer, there's a specific lamppost by the Lincoln Park Zoo that cormorants sit on. And I don't know why. I think it's just a particularly good place maybe to see the water from that particular spot, and maybe they're watching for schools of fish or something, but they're literally just resting there, So yeah, cormorants often just sit around doing nothing because they got to digest that fish they caught.
So
I want that job.
they have
Yeah, that sounds
they
awesome.
have salt glands in their skull too to get rid of the salt, because they get their water from the fish that they eat on average. But if you're ingesting a salty fish and with salty water, that you have to get rid of the salt. And so they get rid of it through salt glands in their skull. And people have done studies to show that, because it was like, okay, well, do they actually use that for that? And they looked at the salt content in the seawater, looked at the salt content in what was being extruded from the salt glands to show that it is more concentrated than the things that they were eating or drinking. So they really are concentrating salt and getting rid of it through there. It's not good to have your salt balance be off. It kind of wrecks with the way your cells work and the way your muscles might work. So you got to keep your ionic concentrations appropriate for vertebrate life.
So I think that's interesting that double-crested cormorants would still have salt glands.
Yeah, so doesn't that lead you to think that they evolved with them in a sea-like thing, and they are retaining those things? I don't know. I don't know.
Yeah, and that's probably true.
It's so funny because we saw so many double-crested cormorants in Florida that were in saltwater. So just our little experience with them, it's I definitely didn't realize that they're so freshwater leaning. So that's really interesting to hear.
Yeah.
What it may be that they really did evolve along coastal estuaries and things like that, and then gradually have adapted to going up the big river valleys like the Mississippi and colonizing lakes and that are purely freshwater.
Well, I think we're getting kind of close on time. Is there anything else on double-crested cormorants we want to talk about?
They vomit fish at predators. So if you're a gull or a crow, you better watch your eyes around them.
I don't know. That sounds like dinner for a gull.
And they do that. Why they actually put their wings out is interesting to me. They have this powdery down feathers underneath the outside of their feathers that people think has something to do with buoyancy in the water, and to enable them to get down further, I suppose, to not just pop right back up. But are they really just drying their wings?
Yeah, I think so. Have you guys ever seen this? So turkey vultures do the same, where they'll sit there with their wings out. Yeah, that's what I've always thought.
Yeah.
Because it is bizarre and very recognizable that they sit there with their wings kind of out like that.
They're just resting.
Just resting between fishing. Yeah.
Resting before they go fishing.
I mean, unfortunately, I would say there's not a whole else that they do.
That's so judgmental.
I love the simplicity.
Yeah,
I know it is.
Well, as RJ said, what do they do?
Now I'm trying to think. I guess that could be leveled at me too.
Yeah, me too.
More like me.
All right. Well, we do have a mailbag question. Are you ready for that?
Yep.
Sure.
All right. So this is Tom from Clarendon Hills, Illinois. And Tom said, I was driving through Indiana and stopped at a rest stop to get a Frosty. I found a pond nearby where I was enjoying my Frosty and then saw a large swan swim by. Are they native to Indiana? I've never noticed one before, but now I'm curious how common they are and how they got here. They're pretty incredible to see in the wild.
Yeah, this made me laugh because some of my worst encounters with birds when I first started watching birds were with swans. But not the native ones. There are two native ones that could be in Indiana, one that could breeds there and one that goes through migration. And then there's this thing called a mute swan, which is introduced, has a bright red kind of beaky, knobby thing on its beak. And those things are mean. They're super aggressive. They're horrible. You should be afraid. You don't go feed the bird if it's a swan. That thing will bite your head off if it had any choice, or take your child. Seriously, they are and they're big. So you should be careful.
So I'm guessing what he saw was a mute swan. Mute swan. And the other species that's native is called trumpeter swan, and they almost went extinct across the Midwest in the early 1900s because of hunting and draining of wetlands and things. And they've been brought back, but they're still not very common anywhere. But they're around.
And you get tundra swans is the other one, and you'll get that during migration only. I think
they breed up in the high Arctic. Yeah, they're a high Arctic.
And they
breeder.
have just like normal swan things. They have black beaks, things like that. They don't have this bizarre orange red thing sticking off its head. And I don't think of them as aggressive in that sense.
Yeah, they would be probably around their nests, but Shannon's right. I mean, so there's actually companies that rent out mute swans to people with, like an industrial complex that has a pond on it that they don't want Canada geese nesting around.
Yeah, except that Rex soccer field's even worse, because the Canada geese could care less. They'll just go further upland into the soccer fields and poop even more. So I don't think it's a very effective thing, because you have these horribly mean birds that are all over it's a liability issue. They are mean.
You put up a sign.
Yeah, that
stay
really
away
works.
from the swan.
Beware of swan.
That really works for people, right? They're going to send their little kid out with bread to feed this really pretty swan, so the kid's going to get its hand bitten or getting chased. There are funny videos that you can look at online of people being chased by, by Canada geese too, but by swans. The swan is a lot bigger than a Canada goose and more aggressive. I mean, Canada geese may do that to you, but not in the same way that they're just a mean look. You just know they're not thinking nice thoughts when they look at you.
Well, and yet at a distance, they're these majestic birds.
Yeah, so pretty.
That's a false pretext for them being around.
The thing that I always think about swans is I don't see them flying very often, but when you do, it's impressive how big they are and the fact that they can get off the ground and fly like they do.
I mean, mute swans are really, I'm not just mean, and like environmentally, they're really bad for the environment. They pull up more plants than they eat, so it's not good for any native vegetation. I think they're just ornery kind of in every possible way you can think of them. So they're really environmentally just not very good. And again, they're not native, so there's no real reason for them to be here. Certainly the plants around here didn't evolve to have mute swans pulling them out of the ground like that. I mean, those birds I read an account of them taking down sandhill cranes.
A
mute swan is so aggressive that it's going after and winning a battle against a sandhill crane, a 4-foot tall bird.
I think that's a matchup of an 8 versus a 1 seed. And I think that it's just the crane has, with that neck, ought to be able to get some of its, and bill ought to be able to get some licks in. That's
okay. Good.
Are they territorial, or what? Why are they so mean? What are they?
I think
that's
they're
what it is.
territorial as any
out of my
place they want
area,
to be.
or
That's their territory.
Okay.
They don't. So they had to, when they're trying with the trumpeter swans to reestablish breeding populations in places where they were, extirpated. They had to get rid of the mute swans, and it was only after they got rid of the mute swans that the breeding programs for trumpeter swans could be successful, because these mute swans will go completely after the trumpeter swans.
Other swans.
Yeah. And then because they wreck the environment so much, the food isn't available in the right ways for other swans to successfully breed. So you really do have to get rid of mute swans. As as sweet as you think they are from pictures and as big as majestic they look, they're not native to North America, so they need to go.
Are they from Europe or?
Yeah.
Okay. Did somebody bring them over because they're so pretty?
Oh, yes.
Yep.
Got to have one of everything in places, right? I mean, that's what British people did in the way back times. So, yeah, I mean, we didn't know humans didn't know for real the consequences of what moving things around could do. So it seems sweet to have a European goldfinch on Long Island and to have house sparrows or starlings places, but that doesn't always go well for the native species.
So Tom could have seen either a trumpeter swan, like it's most likely he saw a mute swan, but
I would put the prospects at about 95% mute swan.
Especially because he's at a quick stop or something like that, wherever he
rest stop.
Yeah. So I don't think of trumpeter swans being right beside the tasty freeze or something like that.
Okay.
Oh.
All right. Well, should we wrap it up then? John, do you want to close it out?
Yeah, I was just going to say that people should think more about eating and resting, because that's what the cormorants do.
Yes.
Amen. That sounds good.
Thanks, everyone, for joining us this week. We appreciate all of you. If you have a question for us, you can reach us at podcast.birdsofafeather@gmail.com. Please follow us on our socials as well. We're on Instagram and TikTok, and all of our episodes are uploaded to YouTube as well. Okay, love you all. See you all next week.